Hesitant, unwilling and tight-lipped, the Western reaction to the Tunisian uprising made people across the Arab world wonder whether democracy in Tunisia will be allowed to run its full course. Will Western powers try to influence the outcome of the Tunisian revolt if it does not serve their interest or if it indeed threatens them? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Rida Fakhri. As the Tunisian protests continue, many people in the Arab world seem to be giving up any hope that the United States or the Western world can be a force for democratic change. The US administration stayed largely silent until the day Ben Ali fled. By then, it was too late. This was yet another example of how Washington favors stability over democracy. Many wanted to believe the former US Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, when she told the world in Cairo in 2005 that the US would no longer support repressive regimes in the name of political expediency.
For 60 years, my country, the United States, pursued stability at the expense of democracy in this region, here in the Middle East. And we achieved neither. Now, we are taking a different course. We are supporting the democratic aspirations of all people.
So on January 13th, the day before Ben Ali's fall, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton lectured a group of Arab leaders assembled in Qatar on the danger of their country sinking into the sand unless they reform their political systems and economies. Those who cling to the status quo may be able to hold back the full impact of their country's problems for a little while, but not forever. She went on to say, if leaders don't offer a positive vision and give young people meaningful ways to contribute, others will fill the vacuum. Well, Clinton's words appeared almost prophetic the next day, but she neglected to mention that most of these leaders were, in fact, US allies. Well, joining us now for this discussion are our guests in Paris, Hall Gardner, Professor of International Politics at the American University of Paris. Also in the French capital, Renaud Girard, foreign correspondent for the French newspaper Le Figaro. Professor Hall Gardner, Hillary Clinton talked about the pitfalls of holding on to the status quo. But does the status quo, in fact, favor anyone and suit anyone more than it does the United States itself?
Well, I disagree with that statement in the sense, at least in Tunisia. In fact, I would say that the status quo has been benefiting the French for several decades now, and that status quo is what's changing. The Americans are moving into the region in terms of economics, and I would say also the Chinese. I would say behind the scenes, in fact, is a rivalry between the United States and China, with the Europeans trying to hold on as best that they can. So I see it a little bit differently than merely American allies struggling, though they are American allies.
The Chinese obviously don't seem to be as invested politically in the region as the United States appears to be, and of course the French and the British as well.
Right. Well, in this case, it's the U.S. moving into well, it's formerly French territory. It still is. I mean, in an economic sense. Now, the Ben Ali government became a loyal ally of the United States in the war on terrorism after 2001. It was already an ally, but it strengthened its relationship, and that's one of the reasons why the United States likewise began to move in and see what investment possibilities were in Tunisia and elsewhere in the region. And the U.S. Department of Commerce has been moving in, looking at Tunisia and Algeria in particular for new investment opportunities.
Renaud Girard, there may be different spheres of influence in the region when it comes to the United States or France today, but the policies remain largely the same, don't they? Has France been blinded all these years in its support for authoritarian regimes, or does it advance its own vested interests? We look at Africa and we see the example of several leaders who were in power for decades. Look at the example of Zaire and President Mobutu Sese Seko, 32 years in power. Omar Bongo, President of Gabon, 42 years in power, and the list goes on.
Yes, I think that for Tunisia, France has been quite blind, actually, though Tunisia is quite close to France. People speak French over there. It's geographically very close to France. Also, a lot of Tunisians go to study in France. Former President Ben Ali himself went to the military school academy in France, in Saint-Cyr. So actually, yes, I mean, for the beginning in the late 80s, you know, in 87, Ben Ali took over, and he was the right man, and French politicians thought that he was a wall against Islamism, so he was welcome. And in the 90s, as a matter of fact, he developed his country quite well. But then the French authorities, the French government did not see, were quite blind. There was an authoritarian trend that developed at the end of the 90s. And for the last decade, the years 2000, you had really a mafia system growing in Tunisia with the Trabelsi family, and that the French were really blind.
But were they blind?
Did
they not see, or did they not want to see? Because it was for everyone to see. Amnesty International, other human rights groups were documenting for many years the repressive nature of his regime and the kinds of things that went on. He may have been the right man at the very beginning of his rule, but could he have stayed in power all these years if it weren't for French support?
I don't think that French influence is that great. You have a French cultural influence, but you have to remember that, you know, Tunisia is independent for the last 55 years. And the beginning of this independence was quite tough with a kind of, you know, they took over the naval base of Bizerte, De Gaulle through paratroopers who took back the naval base, and then the two men reconciled, I mean, Bourguiba and De Gaulle. But then, Tunisia in the beginning, the 60s, was truly an independent country with a very socialist, policy, and they confiscated all the French property and so on. So you cannot say that, you know, there was a kind of neo-colonial power in Tunisia. This is not true. And you didn't have a neo-colonial power, of course, not in Algeria either. So then yes, with Ben Ali in the 90s, and the relationship with the French were quite good because, as I said, Ben Ali was thought as a modernizator, that he was somebody who can modernize his country, and a wall against Islamism. Remember, you had FIS, Fonds Islamique du Salut in Algeria, and you had a civil war in Algeria, and then Tunisia was stable. But then the French had some kind of dogma, if you like. Dogma, Ben Ali is better than, is a less, the lesser evil, if you like. And they were blind. They didn't adapt because, as you said, yes, they probably did not want to see, and
Professor, let me ask then,
we have
Professor Hall Gardner,
it's quite a failure of our diplomacy. Yep.
Was this a failure of Western policy in general, the United States policy? Western governments are very quick to castigate on the leaders who are ideologically opposed to them, while we see leaders with more dubious credentials being given the red carpet. Do you think events in Tunisia will now force Washington, Paris, London to reassess their relationships, or will it be simply business as usual?
Well, let me back up on a few points. First of all, even the French have complained about the Ben Ali government of not opening the doors. The government was so corrupt that you had to take a piece in every. The government would insist on taking a share in any investment, and this factor has created even alienated French companies, even though France in general had an advantage over others. And I think what's happening is an opening up. Ben Ali did open up the economy more than previous leaders who were more or less socialist in their application. So I agree with the previous analysis. But the point is, the region can be opened up even more. And as Hillary Clinton said, the time is now for reforms. So yes.
But beyond words, are we going to see? But beyond words, are we going to see Washington do anything about bringing about reform? Should it indeed even get involved? But if it does, well, and if elections are the cornerstone to democracy,
Washington has to put their money where their mouth is.
Will they?
Yeah. Washington has to put their money where their mouth is, and that's what's happening now. If the United States, having supported the Tunisian revolution, the Jasmine Revolution, doesn't begin to invest, doesn't begin to help stabilize the government and move it in a positive direction over time, I think it will fail, and it will create a backlash in this.
Professor Gardner, excuse me to interrupt you, but is there any evidence that the Obama administration supported the Jasmine Revolution? We didn't hear a single word from President Obama until Ben Ali fled.
Well, again, I really think that's in part because it's considered a French sphere of influence as opposed to an American one. But yet the Americans are moving in behind the scenes. And I think that in a sense, it's like when the Soviet Union collapsed and the empire in Eastern Europe opened up. I think the dictatorial regimes in much of the Arab world are going to be under pressure. There's several reasons for that. One is just the corruption of the governments are not allowing freedom for their citizens. There's what's called the youth bulge. I prefer to call it a youth surge, where you have a large percentage of unemployment that Hillary Clinton referred to, and that people need jobs, and the economies aren't opening enough for that. So you have an explosive. And then you have the third problem, which is a succession crisis. You have aging leaderships who are going to have to transform their government at some point, and there's no clear alternative for these dictators, whether it's Gaddafi, whether it's Mubarak
what
in
happened,
Egypt.
Though, to the different U.S. courts that we just heard Condoleezza Rice moments ago talk about, and that was back in 2005. Granted, she was promising this.
Well,
did the prospect of real, genuine democracy with all the new forces this would bring into the political fold, did that scare away the White House? And
right.
then I would also want René Giraud to talk to me about the French position on this. Go ahead, Professor.
Right. Well, let me back it up a little. If Americans wait to the last minute before the crisis hits, if you look at the WikiLeaks leaks on Tunisia, you know, they were trying to hint that reforms have to be taken, and yet the government, they can't force the government to change. The change had to come from the people, and that's why it's a grassroots movement for democracy, as opposed to the Bush administration trying to force democracy on Iraq and other countries in the region. It's coming from the ground. The United States also supported the colored revolutions in Ukraine and Georgia, for example. And so in some cases, the United States does support these movements from behind the scenes and tries to bring them to the surface. But when they're stuck with a dictator or an extreme corruption, it's the elephant in the room, as the WikiLeaks
Renaud, do all these events then highlight the hypocrisy? Let me ask Renaud Giraud if this highlights.
Yeah, sorry, I just couldn't hear.
The hypocrisy of Western governments and their policies. When dictators are friends, it's fine. The minute they begin to chart a more independent path, then they're easily dumped. And we saw that happen in Panama with Manuel Noriega. We saw that happen with the Shah of Iran back in 1979. Do you think that they're used until they serve a purpose, and then when it is too late, when the public will takes over, then the French, the American, the British then dump these leaders who were once friends?
This is true, but at the same time, what is very important is that the Western world have been traumatized by the fantastic failure of the Americans in Iraq in 2003. You had a viewpoint. I mean, the French, you know, were prophetic. They said that it was a huge mistake and they would not improve the situation in Mesopotamia, which is true. Of course, the situation has not improved. I mean, in Iraq now, you don't have a democracy or whatever. You have just a mess. But since then, you know, politicians in the West are very cautious that we should choose the best. We know that, okay, Saddam Hussein is not good for Iraqi people, so we will put somebody else. I mean, I don't know, Paul Bremer, whoever.
But is it for Western governments to choose? Is it for Western governments to choose? Or is it through the electoral process? If elections are the cornerstone of democracy, why aren't their outcome respected? Look at what happened in Egypt. Look at what happened in the occupied Palestinian territories when the Palestinians chose Hamas in the 2006 elections. What happened? There were sanctions, and there was every opportunity taken to try to paralyze the government there.
As far as Hamas is concerned, you are right. It's a huge contradiction. It's a big mistake from Chirac's government that in the European Union, the only country who didn't want, who was vetoing the fact that Hamas would be put on a terrorist list, was France. And then Chirac was weak because he wanted to be friend again with Bush after the Iraqi thing, and he accepted that. And this is stupid because, of course, Hamas should not be put on the terrorist list, and of course, the European Union should talk to Hamas. Hamas is an important political party in Palestine. You may like it or not like it. They are Muslim Brotherhood, yes, but then it's very important. And it as you said, Hamas won the first democratic elections. So that was That was a huge mistake. I agree with you, but now you have also to acknowledge now that we Western government, especially the French government, think that we don't know what is the best for other countries, and we should not know. I mean, other countries have to develop by themselves, and we mustn't think that we can choose for them. I mean, the last neo-colonial, if you like, adventure of the West is this Afghan thing. In December 2001, in Bonn conference, we decided that we would, at the same time, reconstruct, democratize, and develop Afghanistan. How can France and America and so on say that they will develop Afghanistan when they are not able to develop Haiti, which is very close to the United States border, and you have for like 30 years American military occupation of Haiti, and France has failed to develop Ivory Coast. And why we should democratize with a Western system of presidential elections with 2 rounds in Afghanistan? Why this system? They had a Loya Jirga that worked much better. We put a system that doesn't work. There was no second round in the 2009 elections in Afghanistan. And then, yes, okay, we want to reconstruct it, but instead of sending builders, we send soldiers, and of course soldiers, you know, if you send soldiers, it attracts war. So this is the situation. So I think that now the West have to realize that the West is not able to put regimes and to choose for the Tunisian people which regime would be the best, or to choose the Egyptian, of the Palestinians, of the Afghans, or for the Iraqis.
Professor Hall-Gardner, is part of the problem then that the Western policy is still largely seen through the Islamic fundamentalist bogeyman prism, that as long as there is a religious Islamic angle to any of this, then they very quickly rush onto the scene and want to make changes?
Well, in the case of Afghanistan, as was mentioned, I agree with most of the analysis there, but the problem at the December conference, when they initiated the process of democratization of Afghanistan, they forgot the entire Pashtun population precisely because of its Islamic tendencies. The Loya Jirga was the appropriate path to go, because that was appropriate to the Afghan population and the way the government had worked in the past, and that path was not chosen. It was a major mistake. Now, let me take an example. In the South African Revolution, the United States realized that it couldn't wait and support the South African regime forever. It began to secretly negotiate with the African National Congress and Nelson Mandela. It was able to make a transition from what could have been a potentially explosive, violent revolution to a new South African democracy.
Could you, though, address my question? My point is France and other Western governments now revising their assumption that it is either these leaders who are in power, these autocratic leaders, or bin Laden? Were they forced into this false choice all along, and are they revisiting this or not?
Well, yes, well, the big fear in Tunisia is an Islamic influence. Will the Nahda party remain, support multi-party system? Will it support the rights of and education of women? Or will Islamicists from Algeria begin to infiltrate? Or will Gaddafi begin to try to interfere somehow in the political process in Tunisia? These are the fears that the Americans have.
Should the Americans have a say in who joins the government and what kind of a pluralistic system it is? If it is a so-called unity government, then everyone should be invited to join. And so far, the Nahda movement that you mentioned, which has been banned all these years, the Islamist party says it hasn't really been invited in. Renaud Girard, to what extent do you see this as a failure of the West to identify and accept that democracy means democracy the way these governments see them and not the way the West wants to see it?
I think it was a mistake. I mean, the France, of course, is not responsible of the fact that the army did not, in Algeria, France, didn't allow the Front Islamique du Salut, FIS, to take over. It's an Algerian general's decision. But more or less, France stayed silent and supported it. I think it was a mistake. I think the mistake that there should have been a government of God, of Islamic Front Islamique du Salut, and when people would have realized that the government of God is not better, is not more efficient than the government of men. Probably the Algerian electorate would have gone back to more secular parties. I think that you have to give to all these populations a try. Okay, you want to try a government of God? Okay, try it. I mean, I can tell you that I've been traveling quite often to Iran, and in Iran they had the government of God, and they still have it, and they don't like it. But of course, the problem is that the government of God doesn't want to respect elections and to give back power.
Not quite sure what you mean by the government of God.
Party.
But do you then think that it was a mistake for Western governments, for the French and others, to remain silent when the elections in the early 1990s were cancelled? The second round was cancelled in Algeria when the Islamic Party, the Islamic Salvation Front, was poised to make a huge win. Was it a mistake in hindsight to not have allowed this democratic process to take its full course?
I think that the French in that instance were a little bit short-sighted. I think that the experience of an Islamic government for a while in Algeria with 4 and 5 years and should have been tried, and you still had, you know, the army in the background, the Algerian army, if you know if the Islamic Party didn't want to go back to elections after 4 or 5 years, that could, you know, push them off. So I think that we should have tried it, because we should have shown to these people that, you know, the government of God is not more efficient at all than the government of men.
Are Western governments buying into this argument that keeping them in power would actually protect their interests, or that they are really genuinely a barrier against so-called terrorism?
Well, I would argue in the case of the Nahda Party, which, as you said, it's up to the Tunisians to decide whether they want to admit the Nahda Party into the government. As long as the Nahda Party remains supports a multi-party system, I see no reason why the Americans would seek to oppose its position in the government. It is a voice among the Tunisian people, whether the Americans like that voice or not. That's true democracy. On the other hand, if the party begins to look towards some sort of authoritarian party of God thing, then that would change the situation. But it would also change it for the Tunisians. I don't believe the Tunisians want that kind of system. But then again, the Nahda Party is not Wahhabist. It's not a Taliban. If the parties play by the rules, then there'll be no complaint from the American side.
Renaud Girard, would it be in the long-term interest, or the exact opposite, of the French government, other Western governments, if they continue to support governments in the region, precisely leaders against the will of the people, leaders who do not represent the majority of the population? Will it be against their long-term national security interest?
Yeah, I think that, you know, that you're quite right that when you said that, you know, Western government should try to have a view, to contemplate what can be the future a little bit. And like, for instance, for sure, diplomats, for instance, posted bit in Tunisia or in Algeria or in Egypt or so on, diplomats should also see opposition leaders. And of course, I think that American diplomats or French diplomats in Egypt, for instance, should talk with every prominent political figures in Egypt, including Muslim Brotherhood. Of course, I think it is their job to know, to see what is going to happen in these countries, and not to be so blind, because our diplomacy in France, for instance, told us that, you know, Ben Ali was very strong, very powerful, very good system, and suddenly we have a revolution. We didn't know about that. So our diplomacy didn't make a good job, and certainly our prestige in Tunisia. Of course, we are very close to each other because their language is French, but the prestige of the French government have been diminished by this blindness. So I think we should have a less dogmatic, if you like, a less dogmatic policy, and maybe to try to understand more this kind of Islamist party, Muslim Brotherhood, why they are so powerful, and probably to talk to them a little bit more. Of course, we don't like them. I mean, it's not our ideas. We are secular people, but we should talk to them,
many will also wonder,
including to the Hamas and Muslim Brotherhood.
Many would also wonder whether Western policies also contributed in bringing these parties to such prominence as a reaction to the kind of injustices they have seen in their countries. But I'm afraid we do have to leave it there. I do thank you both very much. In Paris, Hall Gardner, professor at the American University in Paris, also in the French capital, Renaud Girard from Le Figaro. And thank you very much for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. As always, we do welcome your comments and suggestions. You can email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. From all of us now, thanks for watching.